Bwrdd, croeso and welcome. Today we have an extraordinary board meeting to consider the consultation responses and all the evidence to help us to decide where our new hospital should be sited. Although this meeting is being held in public, it's not, however, a public meeting. I'd like to particularly welcome the many members of public who are here today. It's wonderful to see you all, and to thank the Shadows group for speaking with us and enabling us to listen to some of your powerful stories and testimonies outside. And I promise we will meet again around a table to discuss the ways forward. In relation to choosing the site of the new hospital, there's been many public meetings held across the whole of Hywel in all the counties, and the details of which are in today's papers. And just for everybody's knowledge, on the 28th of September, we will be holding our annual general meeting here, and there'll be another opportunity for you to participate, so please come back. So today is a single issue meeting, which reflects the importance of the decision that we have to make. Members of the public will be aware the following recent surveys of the concrete Withybush Hospital, the board took the decision to temporarily close 6 wards and to close many other areas of the hospital for the protection of staff, the protection of patients, and the protection of visitors. And I'd like to take this opportunity to publicly thank all the teams, kitchen staff, domestic staff, estates, therapists, managers, executives, doctors, nurses, volunteers, and more for their incredible effort in making this happen so quickly and so smoothly. As the chief executive said to the media, it was like rebuilding an aeroplane while it was still in the air. The consultation process to choose the site for the new hospital and the temporary closure of large parts of Withybush Hospital are not linked, but the condition of Withybush Hospital, which you've all seen in the media, and the condition of Glangwili Hospital, and many other parts of our estate, underlines and reinforces the urgent need for a new hospital in West Wales. The disruption, the expense, the danger, and the impact on all staff and patient care currently being suffered at Withybush will be repeated again and again, as the funding is only available for short-term repairs and the concrete will continue to deteriorate. And we continue to expect our staff to work in unacceptable conditions across our estate. Also, without this new hospital, our services in West Wales will continue to be spread too thinly and will remain fragile. And we all here will suffer the consequences of that. Never has it been more urgent that we in West Wales have a new hospital fit for purpose and fit for future generations. We in West Wales deserve no less. I'd like to go to the meeting and accept now apologies for absence, please.
Chair, we have apologies from absence from Mr. Winston Weir, independent member of the Finance. I think Mr. Maynard Davis was joining the meeting via Zoom. I'm just not sure if it's connected yet.
Okay, thank you, Joe. Any declarations of interest?
Can I raise a declaration, please? Whilst it's not material, I think for transparency purposes, a member of my family does live adjacent to one of the sites that we are discussing today.
Thank you, Lisa. So I'm going to go on to item 2, but before that, I'd like to welcome those people who are attending today. So we have Eldeg Rosser, Head of Capital Planning. Welcome, Eldeg. Kelly Locke and Kester Holmes from Opinion Research Services. Nick Durham, PDP, and Scott Matthews from Mace. So if I could go over to you now, Lee, please, for the consideration of the land consultation findings.
Do you want to say anything or not?
I was going to, but I think the chair's just said everything that I wanted to say, so I'll pass straight to you.
Okay, fine. Thank you, Chair. So, as the Chair's noted, this is an important milestone in the progression of our strategy. Board members will be very familiar with the steps we've taken over the last few years, but just a very quick recap. 2 years ago, we asked for nominations for land within the zone that we'd identified as part of the strategy development in 2018. That resulted in 11 sites in total being nominated. From that long list of 11 sites, we shortlisted to 5 sites initially, and members will recall that last summer we went through a very extensive appraisal process to reduce that from 5 sites to the 3 sites that we are now considering today. The full report that we've got in front of us today is split into 6 parts with 12 appendices. There's a lot of information, a lot of detail for board members to consider, but inevitably this is a complex and challenging process, so it's only appropriate that we apply that level of rigour to it and also make that information available to the public through our public board meeting papers. The feedback, so that the board are asked to consider today the key themes from the consultation process that we've just gone through, also the feedback from the conscientious consideration that followed that, plus the technical and commercial information we have, the financial, clinical and workforce appraisals, and then the equality and health impact assessment. And we're asking board members to take all of that information into account in order to help reduce the shortlist from 3 to 2 sites, as I was suggesting within the paper, but that is obviously a matter for board discussion shortly. Just to complete the recommendations, we're also recommending that the board reject the 3 alternative site suggestions that did come through in the consultation process, and we're asking that that is done for the reasons given, but again, we may well touch on that later in the discussion. For the benefit of the public, I think it's just important to note that we have had an in-committee meeting prior to this morning, where we had the opportunity to receive the latest position on the commercial discussions with the landowners and the commercial appraisal. It is unusual for us to have an in-committee proceeding public board, but of course there are some commercially sensitive aspects that we need to consider as a board before meeting in public. What I will say though is that a summary of that information is provided within the public board papers, with only the commercially sensitive information redacted. So the vast majority of the information that we discussed this morning is within the public information that we provided today. As Maria says, welcome to Kester Holmes. Kelly Locke of Opinion Research Services have worked with us on the consultation report and reporting, and they'll take us through that shortly. We're going to have around a 15-minute presentation, if that's okay, Chair, so we can properly consider that information. I will also note, though, again, for the public awareness, that board members have had an opportunity to receive that presentation previously and to discuss it thoroughly as part of a board seminar within our conscientious consideration process. So we have gone through all that information previously and helped board members in considering all that information. We've also, you said, got Scott Matthews of Mace and Nick Durham of BDP who have supported us with the technical land work, and Eldeg Rosser from our capital planning team. Just a couple of final points before I hand over. I would also like to acknowledge the support of Llais and their volunteers through this process, in particular the attendance at all the consultation events. We've done a lot, as you've mentioned, Chair. So it was really helpful and encouraging to have their input and very helpful to have their feedback following that process as well. So now I'll hand over to Kester and Kelly, if that's okay, just to take us through that summary of the feedback from the consultation, and then I'll pick up some of the other slides then to complete the picture before we move into board discussion. If that's okay, Chair?
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, Lee. Thank you, Chair. Good morning, Bwrdd. So myself and Kelly are from Opinion Research Services. We're an independent organisation, and it's our job to take all the feedback, analyse it and report it in an open and transparent manner. I'll repeat what I've said to you before, that consultation is not a vote, and that by itself, it's not going to provide the whole answer. It's an opportunity for stakeholders to give their views and an opportunity for the board and other decision makers to consider the feedback arising, but it does need to be considered alongside the technical and commercial considerations. This summary that we've prepared today is very much a summary, and the full report, I think 200 pages or more, prepared by my colleagues, does need to be read alongside it, but hopefully we feel it gives a fair reflection of the key themes. So, the consultation ran for 12 weeks between February and May. It elicited a large, it was a conscientious approach and elicited feedback from a wide range of different stakeholders. The consultation questionnaire itself gained 842 responses, many of those online, some in Welsh, some easy read versions and some young person's versions. It also engaged with a wide range of staff via the Health Board and also some activities that ORS conducted. A representative cross-section of members of the public in each of the localities and many other types of important stakeholders and other members of the public across the region, as well as email responses and social media comment, all of which we've tried to bring together in a comprehensive report. So looking at the key results from the questionnaire, and then I'll hand over to Kelly for more detail. There was a good cross-section across many demographics, age, working status, gender, and so on, and as well as geography. But it is important to consider the overall results and where people came from in terms of their views. So this chart in the blue bar seeks to show the response to the questionnaire compared to the overall Hywel Dda resident population. So you can see that residents living nearest to Bwrdd and Prince Philip hospitals were slightly underrepresented relative to the population. Those living nearest to Glangwili and nearest to Withybush to some extent were slightly overrepresented. But it's just important to bear that in mind in understanding the questionnaire responses. So the questionnaire itself set out the key information about the site options and then asked respondents what they thought about each option, whether it was good, poor, or neither. This slide seeks to present those results with green indicating good, yellowy brown indicating kind of neither good nor poor, and red indicating that people thought it was a poor option. Across those options, reasonably large numbers of people suggested that each option was poor. In the case of Whitland Spring Gardens and Whitland Ty Newydd, at an overall level, around a quarter suggested they were good. And in the case of St Clair's, a larger proportion, around 40%, suggested it was a good option, although just over 40%, 44% suggested even that option was poor. However, it's very important to note that views do differ markedly by respondents' geography, by which hospital people live nearer to. So, looking first at, or looking rather at the first option, Whitland Spring Gardens, those who live nearest to Bwrdd or Prince Philip, very small numbers of people seemed to think this was a good option, and far larger proportions of people thought that option was poor. It's a similar picture for those living nearest to Glangwili, albeit a quarter thought that was a good option. And views amongst those living nearest to Withybush Hospital were more divided, with 42% thinking it was good, or similar-ish number thinking it was poor. Looking at the next option, Whitland Ty Newydd, it's a similar picture. So relatively small proportions of respondents thinking it was respondents living nearest to Bwrdd and Prince Philip thinking it was a good option, larger proportions there thinking it was poor. Just under a quarter of those living nearest to Glangwili thinking it was a good option. And then those living nearest to Withybush, it's not a dissimilar picture. 38% thinking it was good, nearly half thinking it was poor. Looking at the St Clair's option, for those living nearest to Bwrdd and Prince Philip hospitals, a far greater proportion thinking that was a good option, and smaller proportions thinking it was poor. Similar picture for those living nearest to Glangwili, with nearly half thinking it was good. But for those living nearest to Withybush Hospital, only around a third think it was a good option versus more than half thinking it was less good. So the next slide just shows those kind of options and how people living in the different regions tended to think about them in summary. At that point, I'll hand over to my colleague Kelly to tell you a bit more detail about those options.
Thank you, diolch Esther. So if we start off by looking, at the reasons why people thought the sites were either good or poor. Looking firstly at Whitland Spring Gardens, the positive aspects of this site were thought to be the direct access from the A40 and the road infrastructure needing less upgrading, particularly in relation to Tŷ Newydd. The fact is the cheapest option. There's a train station nearby. There's housing being built nearby, apparently, which was thought to be really important in relation to the staff accommodation that would be needed to cater for a new hospital. The fact it's well located on the edge of town and potentially less disruptive for local residents. The equidistance between Glangwili and Withybush. The potential for the off-site renewable energy was thought to be positive, although not quite as positive as the potential for on-site renewable energy in relation to Tŷ Newydd. The fact it's a flat site, so accessible for everyone. For the residents of Pembrokeshire, the fact it's closer to them was a factor. And a lot of people felt it would benefit the local area in terms of economic benefit and job creation. Looking at the less positive aspects, again, access came up, but in a slightly different way. People commenting on the poor road infrastructure in the area. And again, particularly in relation to the accidents, road closures and the congestion on the A40, and the fact that there is a single point of access to that site was thought to be important to consider in relation to those issues. The fact there are multiple private landowners, so potentially costly and complicated sale was raised quite a lot. The clinical and recruitment risks of siting a hospital further west, particularly in relation to patients drifting towards the east into Swansea Bay, and the associated issues around that. The limited room to expand, but you'll see that was thought to be an issue in relation to at least two of the sites. The fact there's some flood risk, and there were mixed views in relation to the benefits for the local area. As I said, some thought it would benefit the local area in terms of that job creation and economic benefit, but others felt that a large hospital in Whitland, which is a relatively small town, would destroy its character. So moving on to Tŷ Newydd, positive aspects were, the main one that came up time and time again was that the site is in public ownership, so potentially less costly and complicated sale. The access, so good public transport links. It's the closest site to a train station, which was thought to be very important. It's the largest site with some scope for expansion, so those facilities and amenities that people thought would be needed on site, so parking, visitor accommodation, all the other range of amenities. The biggest site to allow for that, and also the potential for more green space. There was a lot of positivity about making it a biophilic site, so having that sort of green, open space, natural environment, and having that scope to do that was thought to be important. The on-site renewable energy, as I said, was thought to be important, closer to Pembrokeshire again, and similar issues coming up as well in relation to this as Spring Gardens. Access was thought to be the one of the major drawbacks of Tŷ Newydd, the lack of direct access particularly, and the recognition that a new link road would be needed, which was potentially then expensive and disruptive. Some potential for flooding, although some mitigations were also made in relation to that in terms of elevated road access, car parking and walkways, so something to consider there. And again, similar issues coming up in relation to Tŷ Newydd as they were for Spring Gardens in terms of those clinical and recruitment risks and the destroying the character of the town potentially. If we move on to the third site, which is St Clair's, positives were around access, so good access from both the A40 and the A477, so two points of access there. The fact is geographically central and already has good, or at least better, public transport links. Near us, the larger centres of population, particularly in Carmarthenshire, that was thought to be a positive. And there is existing infrastructure and amenities locally. And again, the fact that housing is being built was raised as a potential positive in relation to the need for that staff accommodation. The single private land ownership, potentially, again, not quite as positive as Tŷ Newydd being in public ownership, but the single private landowner more less complicated potentially than Spring Gardens. The fact there's no flood risk, the potential for off-site renewable energy, less additional travel time overall for the people of the south of Hywel Dda. The fact it's easier to recruit and retain staff came up quite often as well. People talking about how difficult it is already to recruit and retain staff, and moving the hospital even further west could compound that. So the fact that this one is slightly further east was thought to be a positive. Less disruptive to local residents potentially than the two Whitland sites, and less clinical risk, so in relation to that drift towards Swansea Bay, because it is that little bit further east. In terms of negative aspects of Sinclair's, the limited room for expansion came up again in relation to this site. Access, the distance from the train station came up time and time again. People wanting clarity that it would reopen, and when that would be, and would it be in time for the opening of the new hospital. And the fact, in contrast to the two Whitland sites, it is further from Pembrokeshire for people living in those two areas. Feeling that Sinclair's is already too congested to cope with the increased traffic to and from the site. People raising issues around the site's topography, so a few people saying that the site is on a slope, so that would need to be mitigated against in the design. The proximity to the residential areas of Sinclair, so again in relation to the disruption during construction and operation of the hospital, and the fact that it's located next to the A40 was thought to go against those biophilic principles to a degree, which people were generally in favour of. So I'll just run very quickly through the other key themes that came out through the consultation. You won't be surprised to learn that the main key theme that came up time and time again was travel and access. There are still widespread concerns about the plans for a new hospital in principle, and those are primarily around geography and access. Specific worries were around the accessibility to the proposed sites because of the poor road infrastructure in the area. And there was added concern, if you like, in relation to the Welsh Government's willingness to invest in improvements, given the recent moratorium on road building. The poor public transport links to all three sites, and the traffic congestion, particularly in the summer months when the population increases significantly across the whole of the area. There were also concerns around ambulance response times, ambulances being called up more often, given people wouldn't find it as easy to transport themselves to A&E, and the availability of the air ambulance. And there was also a suggestion that the carbon footprint of the new hospital would increase due to lengthier journeys and people switching to car travel. The second main theme was around staff recruitment and retention. There was significant doubt around the Health Board's ability to recruit enough staff, particularly specialist staff, to what they considered a relatively rural and remote site. People mentioning that it's already difficult to recruit to Carmarthen even, as I mentioned, so moving a hospital further west would compound that issue. Concerns that existing staff might leave, so issues around retention because of the longer commutes on top of long shifts. Feeling that the proposed locations might be a barrier to recruiting and retaining ancillary staff. Is that on? I'm not counting that in the 15 minutes. Where was I? So yeah, the barrier to recruiting and retaining ancillary staff. However, some of the focus group participants across a few of the groups thought that filling these roles could actually be a big opportunity for local residents. So coming back to that sort of job creation and economic benefit. The proposed network of community hubs was viewed really positively across the board, but the feasibility of staffing them in addition to the new hospital was a concern. And there was, a lot of positivity about the hospital in principle in terms of having a modern state-of-the-art hospital, encouraging more specialists and staff to work there. So there was certainly positivity in relation to staff recruitment and retention as well. Future-proofing design and infrastructure. As I said, people did question the future-proofing potential of all sites, raising the fact that you always need more than you think you need at the outset. So just making sure that that's considered in the choice of site. The need to consider car parking, green space, and the carbon footprint in the hospital design was also raised. Lots of suggestions made for the facilities and amenities that would be needed around the new hospital. So housing, came up time and again. Visitor accommodation. So for example, a reasonably priced hotel for people who have to travel some distance to the site. Shops, cafes, restaurants, and a helipad for the air ambulance. And some did question the ability of both towns to cope with those infrastructure requirements that would be needed to sustain a new hospital. There were few specific alternative sites, and I won't dwell on this because, as Lee mentioned, these have been discounted already. The only ones that came up were the showground in Nantyci, Caniston Bridge, and Penblewin near Narberth. I should reiterate again that many participants across all consultation methods do still remain fundamentally opposed to the idea of a new hospital, and they support refurbishing the existing site instead and retaining service there. But there was also recognition that what Hywel Dda is trying to achieve, so a modern fit-for-purpose hospital of sufficient size, is not possible on the existing site, so they could understand why other sites were being considered. There was a lot of positivity around the new urgent and planned care hospital across all the consultation methods, and those in favour of it felt that it would be beneficial for the area economically, not just the two towns, but the wider area, and in improving health and wellbeing outcomes. It would help to overcome those staffing challenges, as I mentioned, would provide a modern fit-for-purpose environment for both patients and staff, could also enable the repatriation of some services. So some services people currently have to travel to Morriston or even further afield for could be brought back into the Hywel Dda area. And also a feeling that it could be a catalyst for those infrastructure improvements we talked about, so roads, public transport and schools. And there was also some feeling that people will eventually be prepared to travel for the best and more streamlined care, the seamless care, but acknowledgement that there is a nervousness of change and that ongoing dialogue, communication and reassurance is essential. And as I said, the network of community hospitals and hubs was welcomed. Finally, in terms of equalities impacts, most equalities concerns didn't centre on any particular site. They centred on travel and access more generally and the ease with which people would be able to travel to the new hospital. Several groups were highlighted as being particularly vulnerable in this respect. So vulnerable and older people, people with disabilities, people on lower incomes and or without access to private transport. Expectant parents, so particularly mothers with conditions that need monitoring throughout the pregnancy, and those who would have to give birth at the new hospital for that reason, and also parents of babies requiring neonatal care, and people with additional complex needs like neurodivergence and learning disabilities. There were also concerns about the impact of the proposals on people in different geographies, particularly residents of West Pembrokeshire, East Carmarthenshire and some parts of Ceredigion. People in rural isolation, again, if they're reliant on public transport. Those living in areas with poor digital connections, so they'd be unable to access the telemedicine and digital healthcare opportunities on offer. And also Welsh speakers, particularly in relation to Carmarthenshire. So if residents of Carmarthenshire are displaced to Swansea, they would be less likely to be able to receive services in their preferred language, simply because there's less Welsh spoken there. I think that's it.
Thank you very much, both. Thank you for taking us through that and sticking to the brief. I appreciate it. So I'm happy to pause at that point if anyone has any immediate questions, or equally I'm happy to just continue into the rest of the slide set so we can complete the picture before getting into a discussion. But just in case there's any urgent questions following the presentation.
Are there any questions? And just for members of the public, we did have a full session on the consultation responses as part of this process. They called it conscientious consideration. And so we did have a full debate. There will be questions at the end of the presentations. Lee?
Yes, absolutely. So we're pulling up the slides. Second set of slides, yeah. Okay. I'll just start to go through it anyway once the slides come up on the screen, because everyone's got it on there in their packs. So we've got a presentation that is really a summary of all the detail that is presented today, just to draw out some of the key points. Great, thank you very much. So several parts to it, as I say, which I'll just take us through quickly. I'm not going to spend a lot of time on every point because all the information is available, but clearly it just is helpful to frame the discussion, and then we can move into a conversation about it. So this is what we're doing today, and I'll just take you through some of the key points now. So just a reminder of the 3 sites that we've got, and a high-level overview of the factors that are influencing our thinking today when we consider that, in addition to the consultation information that we've talked about. So I won't go into these in detail now because they're picked up through the slides, but this is just a summary that gives you board members opportunity to have at a glance view of the differentials between the 3 sites. So the outcome of the land consultation, I won't repeat what has just been said, but we've gone through a process following the selection of the 3 shortlisted sites to have a conversation and a consultation engagement process with our population, which, as has been mentioned, has been very helpful. And I've participated in quite a number of events, and I personally have found that very helpful, actually, to get into the discussions and debates around the merits of the different sites and some of the real challenges, I guess, that we face as an organisation, and not least the rurality challenges related to that. Following that consultation, we've had a conscientious consideration process, which included a board seminar, as mentioned, and that brings us up to today. Just a quick reminder, the purpose of the consultation was to try and answer 3 specific questions in relation to the sites. What we were not looking to do is reopen some of the decisions we'd already made, such as looking for additional sites, albeit, as mentioned, there have been some suggestions that have come through that process, nor were we looking to revisit the strategy overall and the general vision that we've got around a healthier Middle West Wales. The purpose of that conscientious consideration then is that we take some time to properly reflect on the feedback that we've had from our population and stakeholders in helping us to make that decision. So over the period of the last few weeks, we've had the opportunity to share that with a number of stakeholders, not just the board, in order to test whether they think the report that we've just gone through properly reflects the discussions and feedback that we've had through the consultation process. And then we've got a timeline here, just setting up some of the key dates. One thing just to point out importantly, I guess, for board assurance is that we've had a further certificate of best practice from the Consultation Institute in relation to that consultation process. So we've endeavoured throughout this to follow exactly the best practice guidance, and we've had some external validation of that approach. Kelly has taken us through, in particular, some of the key points that came through the feedback, so I won't repeat that, but there are some very common themes which we will be very familiar with, and certainly it reflects the discussions I've had when I've been in the consultation meetings. And yeah, that draws out some of those key points then from the conscientious consideration points. So firstly, from the stakeholder feedback, which I think reiterates many of the points that we've picked up, and then from the board seminar discussion on the 24th of August, and a similar set of considerations relating to that consultation. So that's just a quick run through of the consultation elements, in addition to what's been said by Esther and Kelly. So the technical appraisal, this just gives board members a sense of the relative locations of the 3 sites. They're in relatively close proximity, but clearly the 2 Whitland sites are more or less adjacent, and the Sinclair's is in a different location. And I think that's reflected in the consultation feedback, in the geographical differences in the to what extent they favour the different sites. We've looked quite a lot at the accessibility to those sites, and obviously previously when we had the Narberth site, that was part of consideration. There is not a huge difference, as you can see, in terms of the travel time when you look at it on a total population basis, but clearly there is a difference depending on whether you're travelling from east or west as to whether Sinclair's or Whitland is closer for individuals. There is a bit of a difference, I guess, there between the 2 locations, in that the Sinclair's site is a bit closer in the 1 to 10 minute category, and the Whitland site has got more in that 10 to 20 category, and then conversely, the Sinclair's site has more in the 20+ minutes category. So there's marginal differences, but just a slight difference there. Everyone, I think, is familiar with the sites now, so I won't dwell on these, but as a quick run through, Spring Gardens is to the north of Whitland, 47 acres. Just a reminder that the design you see on the right-hand side is not an actual proposal of the hospital. It's just a test for fit within that space. Tŷ Newydd, we know, is the much larger site, 157 acres, as we mentioned. That's to the southeast of Whitland. We do need to secure access to the site off that roundabout. In addition, you can see some blue areas there that at the top, which would be important for us to consider. And then Sinclair's is the smallest of the three sites, slightly smaller than the Spring Garden site at 47 acres. We do have a blue area to the west of the site where there's further opportunity and discussions ongoing as with regard additional potential to acquire additional land, which would then make it similar to Spring Gardens. And it's on that roundabout essentially where the two roads meet at Sinclair's. We've gone through quite an extensive process of technically appraising the three sites that we've mentioned, and all that information is available today and presented in summary as well. So the technical team through that process has looked to assess the risks associated with them. We did present our risk assessment at the last board meeting last August. Those risks have been updated now following further information as things have developed, and that has changed the order to some extent. So there is a risk differential there. Low number, just to be clear, is less risk. A higher number is more risk. So you can see the Tŷ Newydd scores lowest, and then Spring Gardens, Sinclair's. What I would say when you look at the detail is most of those risks are categorized as low to medium. There are a few that are in a higher risk category, which you might want to touch on, but mainly they're in the low to medium category. So just to bear that in mind when you're considering the differentials between the three sites. I think the point at the bottom is probably the most important in relation to that, which is there are no fundamental issues that we identified that will prevent development on any of the three sites. So from a technical point of view, we believe at this stage we can build a hospital on all three sites. There are further considerations, obviously, for us beyond that. This is a quick summary of where those differentials are between the three sites from the risk point of view. I won't go through them in turn, but I think they come through the papers in quite a lot of detail, and there'll be points we may want to discuss later. What we have done, which is new for this board meeting and wasn't something we did as part of the August board meeting last year, was requested some expert guidance on the suitability of building a hospital from a biophilic perspective, a biodiversity perspective, and the differences between the three sites. So we've had a report on that, which is in the pack. The report, I think, emphasises that as all three sites are farmland, agricultural land, essentially, that they are all starting from a relatively low base in terms of biodiversity because they have been farmed. Tŷ Newydd has been more significantly farmed in that sense. So there is a lower baseline, if you like, from a biodiversity point of view. So there's greater opportunity as a result of that. It does have some additional advantages, of course, with the size of the land and the river and the views and so on as well that factor into that. So we've had that independent assessment from a professor in Swansea University to help us with that consideration. Commercial appraisal. So this is the item that we discussed in most detail in the in committee. As we've been clear through the process, there are differences in the ownership of the three sites, and that was certainly a point of discussion in many of the consultation events that we held, and has come through the report that we've just been taking through now. As a reminder, Spring Gardens is in private ownership, multiple private owners, so that adds a level of complexity to the discussions. Tŷ Newydd is in public ownership. The Carmarthenshire County Council own that. and therefore that makes potential acquisition more straightforward inevitably because there's a process for that. That said, we would still need to acquire, as I mentioned earlier, some land that is outside of that the ownership of the council. So there is a consideration there. And then the Sinclair site is in single private ownership. So that is similar to Spring Gardens in the fact that it requires negotiation and agreement, but obviously is slightly more straightforward in the sense that there is only one single private landowner. What we have drawn out there is some differences in where we've got to with the commercial discussions as well. So you'll see in particular the line about ability to agree terms is a different point of difference between the three sites. Equally, the point around the risk of losing sites due to the timings of our process is a point of difference. So as we stand here today, or sit here today, the process that we're required to follow from Welsh Government business case process does mean we're not at a point where we'd be able to acquire any of those sites at this stage, and that is inevitably a factor in the discussions that we're having with landowners, because naturally people favour outcomes that are in the short term as opposed to over a medium term and are less certain. So that is important consideration for us. Just to complete the picture then, I won't spend much time on this, but what we've done is refresh the finance and economic appraisal that we did ahead of last summer's board meeting. The capital cost, there is a differential, as we've said in the consultation documentation and has come out of the pack. We don't believe overall that is that significant. It is in value terms, in that it's several millions of pounds difference. But when you look at that from a proportion of the overall development costs, that is probably not the deciding factor for us in our considerations. But important for that to board members to be aware of that. These figures will of course update over the period that we'd be looking to develop anyway. So this is a point in time assessment. From a revenue point of view and from economic point of view, we've not been able to find any distinguishing factors, if you like, between the three sites. So we don't have any information at this point or evidence at this point that would suggest those two considerations would favour one or other of the sites. Clinical workforce we've not repeated this information since last summer, but they still are extant essentially in our assessment. So the clinical considerations were important in our deliberations last summer, in particular the concerns around neonatal obstetric and paediatric services. So to remind board members, we did some analysis as best we could, given there is a degree of uncertainty in relation to the number of births that could be affected by the location of the hospital. And you can see the spread of that across the three parts of our zone. We, as a result of that was the determining factor in Narberth being excluded from the process last summer. And you can see the reason for that, because we think that not only has a bearing on obstetric services, but also that can lead to having an implication for paediatrics and other services that rely on those services. So there is a balance for us to consider in our deliberations between the level of risk associated with the location of the hospital versus the need to ensure equity of access. I will just remind board members as well that in those discussions, the clinical teams did express concern around the zone itself, and certainly some favoured the current location, which is Carmarthen, but clearly we've gone past that point, and we consider all those factors when we decided the zone back in 2018. But just for completeness, I'll just wanted to mention that again. We didn't find such a difference in stroke services. There was less of a clinical view on that. Clearly it will make a difference to activity levels, but in terms of the viability of services as a result, there was less of a distinction between the three. Workforce, similarly, we've we have a lot of discussions, and certainly within the consultation, the feedback is it does feature the questions around workforce and sustainability do feature recruitment and retention. But when we looked to appraise the three different sites led by Director of Workforce Lisa, we couldn't find any evidence that either one of the sites would be better or worse in relation to those considerations. That said, we know it is nonetheless a concern even as we sit here today. And then finally, we've kept a live dynamic document going in relation to equality health impact assessments, and many of those concerns, as we've gone through it, reflect the points that have come through the consultation document and the process and the report that we received today. So they are to some extent drawing out many of those points that we'd identified, but for board members to be aware that we have refreshed it following the consultation, and we will continue to refresh it as this process goes forward. So I will stop there. I know there's a quick run through of a very substantial amount of information, and I'm sure board members have lots of questions and comments to make, but rather than me taking them too much of time, I thought I'd just frame the conversation and then allow board members to have the discussion from there, if that's okay, Chair.
Thank you, Lee, and thank you to you and all your team and partners who've done such detailed evidence gathering in this respect. I'm going to open to questions, and as Joe's just reminded me, the questions are from the board members today because it's not a public meeting. I'm going to ask you to speak into your microphones, please, so that it can be heard. Can you hear me?
Yeah.
Thank you. Okay, thank you. And I'd also like to remind everybody that all the detail that we are considering today is available to the public on the website. So who would like to ask the first question, please? Anne.
Thank you. I think it's more elder to answer this. To give people a visual of the acreage, to give people a visual of the acreage, what's the acreage of Glangwili and Withybush at the present time? And that way then you can visualise sitting a hospital in a land in my mind.
No, you need to move.
You'll have to move to a mic.
Do you want me to answer?
Okay.
I'm happy.
Lee has the...
Oh, go on. You've got a mic.
Can you hear me?
Yeah.
Yeah, so Glangwili.
No, sorry, the people at the back can't hear you.
I speak into it.
Okay, so Glangwili is 25 acres and Withybush is 20 acres.
Okay,
Thank you.
a lot bigger.
Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Next questions, please. Nelly.
Diolch, Cadeirydd. Thank you, Chair. The issue for me is, and I'm sure, and members of the public, you've mentioned, Lee, about transport and transport infrastructure. And as we know, our area is semi-rural and rural at best. So what negotiations are we having with Welsh Government about increasing our ability for our patients and our relatives to be able to travel?
Yeah, happy to pick that up. This is a point we come back to time and time again, isn't it? And it is probably the question that is in our public's mind when they're considering the changes. I think we have had continuing dialogue with Welsh Government and Transport for Wales. They're part of our transport group, so we have a mechanism to progress those discussions. We obviously know there is work ongoing at the moment in relation to the dual cut of the road and making some of that the A40 making some of that road dual in parts, but at this stage we've got no indication that that's going to extend beyond that current piece of work. There is a set of plans and proposals in relation to increasing the frequency of the train lines into West Wales, which would potentially help. But I think certainly when it comes to transport, the two key modes of transport will be road and, for some people, bus as a public transport. So we are in dialogue with Transport Wales around that. We certainly anticipate that depending on where we build the hospital, that would lead to an increase in bus routes in that area, and that'll be a piece of work for us to progress when we get to that stage. But I think it is important for us to be honest that we are to some extent limited in our transport options and the extent to which that's going to change in the next 10 years. So we do believe there are options, but I think we should be clear that it's not going to radically change over that time period. What we are doing though, in addition to that, is we have a transport strategy that we've developed, which sets out how we want to try and approach that question further, and we'll be looking to develop that over the coming years, working with our partner organisations. So there's a joint committee between the local authorities across southwest Wales that we are connected into, which one of their tasks is to develop a transport strategy for the region, so we can input into that and influence that. And the other opportunities that exist are for us to look at alternative ways of supporting people with their transport. So there are examples already of social and community models which assist people with transport and so on, and we'll be looking to do what we can to encourage and support those to progress, and obviously once we know where we're going to build the hospital, then we can have more concerted conversations around that. But some of those exist now, because obviously a number of people struggle to get to our sites today, and we'll be looking to build on that over the period. But it is undoubtedly the primary concern, I would say, for our public.
Thank you, Lee. And I'm going to bring in Steve on the same point.
Yeah, just to add a bit of context, I know today we are focused on the new hospital, but it's also worth having in our minds the strategy is to ensure that through the local networks, the local centres we want to set up, including the repurposing of Glangwili and Withybush, our ambition is much of the activity will continue outside of this new site. So whilst some of this is very much in the partnership realm, as Lee's described, some of it is in our control to ensure that people can get care much more close to home than they can at the moment.
Thank you. Michael and then Rodri.
Yeah, thank you, Chair. Yes, just building on the points we just discussed, I'm afraid, because it's probably the most important one in the public's mind. On the equality impact assessment, I would characterise the mitigations that is in the document as currently widely drawn, and I think that's not a criticism. That's because of where we are in the process, but they are widely drawn, I would say. So, as we develop this, is there going to be more flesh on those bones? I would like to see, particularly as the maybe options start to become more focused. There's talk about transport strategy that needs to be cross-referenced into it as well. So I would say I note that it's called a live document, but I would seek assurance that really, very quickly after this feedback, that flesh starts to be put on those bones as we move forward. I thought that will give the board and members of the public assurance. And also I would touch on, issues again mentioned of, we of course have the socio-economic duty now in Wales. I think that needs to be again very carefully looked at, and the Welsh language issue as well. So I think they need to be again brought forward, even more detailed as we go forward with this process. Thank you, Chair.
Yeah, just to respond to that. So I agree with Michael. So as I say, it's a live dynamic document. We will be updating it. We're at the stage, obviously, where we're describing potential site options, but there's a whole set of considerations beyond that in relation to the clinical models as well. So as they start to become clearer over the period, it'll help us put more meat on the bones, as you say, in relation to how we might respond to those equality impacts. So it's not just about the sites and the hospital, it's actually the wider strategy, and as Steve points out, the way in which we design our services will have quite a bearing on to what extent we are impacting on the equity of access to services. So that'd be something we need to progress over the period of years, and to say, well, it'll be something we'll be bring it back to the board at every time we bring an update such as this.
Thank you, Rodri.
Yeah.
Sorry. Okay. May I thank you all very much for coming. I'll adjourn for a few minutes to let you leave the room with dignity. Well, thank you very much, and we'll see you all soon. Safe journey back. Diolch yn fawr. Thank you and welcome back, everyone. Croeso. Sorry for the adjournment, but we felt it was very important that people had the time to leave the room and go on their long journey back to Ammanford. So I think the person who was going to be asking the next question is Rodri, and then Judith.
Thank you.
Thank you, Chair. And firstly, the document we've got in front of us, I have to say it's kind of very detailed, and thank you for all that work. Just looking at the finance and economic executive summary, there's two things I just want to pick up. But I think for me, looking at kind of, obviously there is a difference in cost, but kind of, I think that last line in that table does highlight that a percentage of the overall estimated work costs, the range is less than 1.5%. So for me, that kind of is not a factor, but well, it is a factor, but also kind of, I think there are the one I'm looking at mostly is the areas of risk, and I don't know, Lee, if you could perhaps just look at this and just explain a bit of this, because a commercial evaluation of risks, and I'm just thinking, you look at the three there, there's a 57% chance, because we all know we need another hospital, kind of with things as they are, we need it as soon as possible. And I'm just thinking with a 57% risk factor on one of them, obviously there's a, where there's a note, and the other one's 29%. Would someone with a risk factor that high, kind of, what's the probability, not probability, but kind of, do people look at it kind of thinking, right, what's the chance that that one will fail because of the risk factor being so high?
Yeah, I'm happy to answer that, and then I'll probably ask Scott or Nick to add a comment as well. So I think the first thing to say, just to clarify that point, the percentage figures we've got there are describing the percentage of reds in from the criteria or the areas of risk that we've identified there. So it's I suppose a fairly arbitrary way of trying to bring some comparison between them. It doesn't mean that Spring Gardens has a 57% risk attached to it and so on for the others. It's just saying that of those risk areas, 57% of the risks that we looked at were red for Spring Gardens. And then there weren't any reds for T Newydd, but that does not mean it does not have risk. We've got some flag there, and there's quite a lot of detail in the associate appendix. And then similarly for St Clair's, there's a couple of areas. So I think it's probably important to look at where those risks are and take that into account. So I've already picked up the point around the risk of losing the sites due to timescales, but also around the ability to agree terms. And then there's other risks for St Clair's, for example, relating to the railway, the train station, and the opportunity to expand beyond the land that's available, and so on. So we need to look at each of those individual risks, I guess, to inform our decision making around this, and to what extent we think one is a critical risk or otherwise, and what weight we put on them. I will just go back to what I'd said, though most of the risks are in the low to medium category, so that's why we think that they are all technically viable as sites, but there are some differences between the sites which we need to be aware of and consider within our deliberations today. So I don't know if I can ask Scott or Nick, because you participated in looking at this these risks for us, whether you, from the land technical team, whether you want to add some comments.
Do you want to take that one? Oh, okay. Right. I think from the slide, the commercial evaluation of risks, that's obviously something that was discussed this morning. I expect in quite a bit of detail with Scott Caldwell around the timings and things. The technical risk analysis, as Lee said, there are very little differences between the sites. The risks are either common with slightly different scoring ranges across each of the sites, or there are one or two individual risks that have been brought out, which are specific to the risks to each of the sites. I think there was a slide, wasn't there? Yes, there we are. So one site, for example, has archaeological remains in the vicinity, so that is a specific risk to the Spring Garden site, not applicable to the others. There is the train station, as you mentioned, Lee, which is a specific risk in the fact that it hasn't reopened yet, and that's obviously only relevant to St Clair's, and they are the two risks that are specific to each other from a technical perspective. And then there's the ransom strip on Spring Gardens, which is obviously specific to the Spring Garden site as well. The other key or higher risks or highest risks across the sites are then common to each of the three sites.
I think just to add that the risks that we're seeing here from a technical perspective are not unusual. In terms of a development of this size and scale, they are the risks that we would expect to see and expect to have to deal with during future stages of design development. So there's nothing on any of the sites from a technical perspective that we are overly concerned about.
Just on that, kind of with some of them, like extent of legal title issues, kind of, do you score those in a matrix kind of on a higher scale to some of the others? Because that would be one of the determining factors, really, wouldn't it?
Yes, and I think that going back to the table on slide, well, I can't, the numbers dropping.
On page 20, yeah, that 28 is the page.
Going back to that table that looks then at the commercial risk,
Yes,
and I think
yeah.
yes, they are then factored slightly differently in terms of that red, amber, green analysis. So the that's how the differences between the sites have been categorised from a commercial perspective.
Thank you.
Thank you, Judith.
Yeah, thank you. First of all, if I may, I know we've moved on a little bit, but I would like to add my thanks to all the staff at Withybush and at South Penns for all that they have done to facilitate the very swift move of patients. So I just wanted to do that. And it does draw to mind the importance of the nature of the facilities our staff are operating out of, which, you know, this is really part of the focus of today. I just wanted to expand a little bit on the risk, and if I can, because I think the one which is about losing the sites just seems really important. And I just wonder, it's about the timings that we are able to adopt, because we don't have the ability ourselves to purchase land. And I just wonder sort of, it's almost how long's that piece of string? Have we got an idea of the nature of that risk in terms of timescales? Because we are obviously dependent on decisions made elsewhere.
I come in to respond to that. So, yeah, I think it's a very important point, Judith, and as we've discussed, it's a really important consideration for us and an important point for board members to have in the forefront of their mind, that we are in this position where we don't have control over our destiny in that regard. So we've been clear through the process that we don't own any of the sites we've been looking at, even when we went back to the 11 short a long list we had previously. So we've always had this risk that sites may remove themselves from the process at any point. We have to accept that to some extent. So to answer the questions directly, so the T Newydd site, we obviously have a partner organisation who owns that site, and there is a process by which we could acquire that site if that was our preferred option. So we can have a relatively high degree of confidence that we could acquire that site, at least in line with our timescales and our process. There are other sites, so as I've mentioned, that we would still need to acquire in order to get access to that site. So that risk is not eliminated for that site, but it is greatly reduced because the main site, if you like, is under public ownership. The two other sites are in private ownership, as we mentioned. Discussions have been progressing with the landowners, and you can see a differential there in between the two sites in relation to our likelihood of being able to agree terms and a price in relation to those sites. The sticking point, the significant challenge for us is that the timings of our process are not aligning with the aspirations of those landowners. So our timings, for clarity, are driven by the business case process. The normal process would be that we would submit a programme business case or strategic outline case, which would allow Welsh Government to support us to progress to outline business case, which we've talked about before. We're at the point where we've not had our programme business case endorsed yet, and Welsh Government have asked us to produce a SOC. So our intentions are that, subject to the clinical review that Nuffield Trust have undertaken, we would hope that that would allow Minister and Welsh Government to support our programme business case. Clearly, that's a very important milestone for us in our strategy. Following that, we will be bringing the SOC back to the board for consideration, likely in November, depending on that first point, which we would then submit to Welsh Government for their consideration and further scrutiny. Then, if Welsh Government are inclined to support that strategic outline case, we would then move to outline business case. So indicatively, we would expect that to be the early part of next year, but clearly that's subject to that decision-making process. We would then look through that outline business case process to choose our preferred site, probably midway through the outline business case phase. That would be the standard process. So we're probably looking at sometime around this point next year that we would be in a position to reach that point, but it wouldn't actually be until full business case stage that we could secure the funding to commit to purchase of the site. So we are asking landowners to hold on for quite a period of time, which is why that risk is so prevalent in the documentation. We have been raising this with Welsh Government, as board members know, and we have got a further opportunity to discuss that with Welsh Government colleagues in coming weeks to see whether there's another way in which we could approach that, so that we continue to have more than one site, if you like, within the process, because we obviously want that to be the position and to make sure we get to the right decision, the right choice for the long term of West Wales and for our population. So it is a very significant consideration for us, and so I think hopefully I've set that out, Judith, but happy to pick up anything further.
That's really helpful. Thank you.
Thank you. Lee, can I follow up on that, please? Can you remind the board when we first submitted the programme business case, the date, and also in view of the RAC issue in Withybush Hospital, where there are short-term repairs and it will be repeated disruption, repeated danger, repeated impact on services. Is there any possibility that, or has been any indication that this process can be accelerated at all?
Okay. Yeah, so in answer to the first question, obviously we developed a strategy in 2018 within COVID and other disruptions, but we presented the programme business case to the board at the end of January last year, so 2022, and following approval by board, it was submitted to Welsh Government the week after, so the first week of February 2022. We have attended Infrastructure Investment Board with Welsh Government last summer, and then following that, we were asked to produce the strategic outline case and the clinical review, which obviously were additions to the process that we were previously planning on. That clinical review didn't commence until earlier this summer, so there was a delay there, and obviously we're now at a point where we're awaiting the final draft of that report to allow us to progress the strategic outline case further. So we are around 20 months delayed since that submission of the programme business case, and the strategic outline case is likely to indicate obviously that delay will translate into a delay with the new hospital and other sites. In relation to the RAC, so yeah, it's a very important point to be clear on that the RAC work that we're progressing with at the moment within Withybush is trying to make safe, if you like, those planks that are at highest risk. It doesn't do that for all the planks in all areas. Some areas we have taken that approach, but in other areas we've not progressed the work on the medium risk or the low risk planks. So those planks will require ongoing surveys for us to ensure that they are safe for us to continue to use those areas, and that will need to continue indefinitely. Obviously, the ultimate treatment of the rack issue is for the removal of rack, and that is certainly the intention that the intention of other parts of the UK to get to that point. We don't have a plan to do that at the moment, other than what we're proposing here, because obviously this is the fastest possible timeline really to addressing that, subject to progressing. We've had Welsh Government support in relation to capital funding for RAC, which is very positive, and very important for us to acknowledge that, at least for this initial phase. There is that will feature, I think, as part of our discussions with Welsh Government over the coming months, because clearly we would be making the case that we, rather than treating the symptoms of RAC, it would be better to come to a definitive plan for Withybush site over the long term, which is obviously what we're proposing within the strategy. It's also just worth emphasising that it's not just the RAC issue. We have significant issues in relation to the business, continuing to provide safe services from the site. So we've got something called a business continuity business case, which is in with Welsh Government, that we are progressing for all our sites, but particularly relevant are Withybush and Glangwili, and that is in the tens of millions. And similarly, we've obviously got the fire work that we're currently progressing as well, and phases of that. So what we're aiming to achieve is minimising the amount of investment and disruption we need to cause on the sites over the short to medium term by progressing the strategy at the earliest opportunity. So that'll be one of the cases we'll be putting to Welsh Government. At this point, though, we have, to answer your question directly, we've got no indication that there is an alternative way forward. But that, as I say, will be the key discussion point for Steve and I and other execs when we meet with Welsh Government shortly.
Thanks, Lee. So it's fair to say that propping up Withybush and Glangwili cost the public purse millions and millions and millions, as well as the disruption to services and the impact on staff and patients in this intervening period.
Yeah, it's in the tens of millions, and of course the concern is that doesn't stop when you've done that period of work.
Ongoing.
We would still, we don't know the totality of what would be needed, but the buildings are obviously of an age that would need to continue.
Yeah, okay. Thank you for that clarity. Chantel.
Thank you, Chair. I just wanted to go back to the issue around access. And one of the concerns that was raised through the consultation was around access to digital healthcare. And I'm just wondering the measures that we would be taking in order to ensure that we can improve access to digital healthcare, because it's with us and we're going to have to come to terms with that. And obviously we need to make sure that all individuals within society will be able to have access to that.
You might be best placed to answer.
Yeah, happy to pick that up. There is a very active digital inclusion programme that we have been embarking on now for, I think, the last 6 months. And that then builds on the work that we're doing in terms of our long-term digital strategy, because clearly enabling patients and the public to access services digitally becomes quite a crucial part of our long-term direction of travel.
Thank you.
If I could just come in on that as well, because I think there are probably two issues. One is the way in which we provide services digitally, but there's also, I think, the consultation was, some of the feedback was around rural connectivity in particular, and the reliability of that. And we are in discussion with Welsh Government through the Chief Digital Officer's office about how we can work with them on much more improved 5G connectivity out in our rural areas.
Thank you. If I could bring in Ewan and then Mansell.
Okay, thank you, Chair. Picking up on the issue that's been raised through the consultation around staff recruitment and retention, I think regardless of the three sites which we have presented to us today, I don't think that perhaps the public really understand in some of the respect what benefits this will bring in terms of to our wider socioeconomic kind of economy here in West Wales. We are crying out for good jobs. We are crying out for, you know, kind of new places in which to work to attract not only kind of new people coming in with specialist skills, but also to encourage and retain our workforce as well. Now, I think from looking through the consultation, fully appreciating the emotive topics and people's kind of saying, oh, you know, people won't travel to work. We know that one of the comments, people find it difficult to recruit into Glangwili at the moment. So how will this actually, you know, recruit people to actually work there? Well, have people actually seen the facilities our staff are working in? Some of them, with all due respect, are not fit for purpose. And a sticking plaster from Welsh Government will not help us. We need a new facility in West Wales. We need it. Our staff deserve it. Our patients deserve it. And our communities actually, I think, deserve it as well. And certainly we know from considerable data which already exists across the FE and HE sectors that should there be good quality jobs in good quality facilities, we will retain a lot of our young people. Welsh Government themselves need to look at their own documentation. The Future and Wellbeing Generations Act is very clear in terms of its components around the availability and the promotion of good quality jobs in facilities, in sectors which are important to that locality. We know that health in West Wales, collectively Hywel Dda employs 12,000 people across 3 counties. We need to make sure that we retain the bulk of those individuals. We have an aging workforce population. So how are we going to attract people coming in to fill those places which are going to be naturally made vacant through our fantastic workforce deciding, I've done my time and it's time to go on? We need to look at the future. And I think whilst the public, yes, are very concerned about the here and now, I think we need to perhaps do a little bit more, perhaps in education, looking at the future of the workforce in West Wales, the future services in West Wales. And I think a new hospital, regardless of its site, offers us a huge opportunity to really lead at the forefront of a socioeconomic revolution in West Wales, of what it will offer. And I think the partnerships that Hywel Dda has already kind of created with Aberystwyth University, looking there, and also locally with our FE colleges, we're thinking of the apprentices that come through Pembrokeshire College. I think there's huge opportunities there, and staff will travel. There is this assumption that people will only go to what's on their doorstep. That is few and far between. If you look at the travel to work rates that we see in Wales, people in rural areas are already prepared to travel for a good opportunity, a good salary, and good prospects. So I think we shouldn't perhaps get too caught up by the loud singular voices, and let's work with perhaps the more silent majority of our population who are very, I think, supportive of a new hospital. But we need Welsh Government, I think, to step up to the plate and not provide the sticking plaster finance. We need long-term solutions which will revitalise all our communities and our community assets as well.
Thanks, Ewan. Mansell.
Yeah, thank you, Chair. I was pleased to hear Steve bring it to the forefront about the hubs and the community network, which in effect will possibly mitigate a lot of travel to the new hospital. And I think that was teased out during the consultation process as well. I brought this up before, and I just mentioned it again, in relation to the St. Clair's issue with the train station. And at the very beginning, Transport were very keen, saying, we'll look as though we may reopen this. Now, they've come out in the last few months to say it's highly unlikely they will do that. Now, so I suppose the question I would have would be, would the health board still go forward on that option, bearing in mind, I'm looking at Phil, the obs and gynae issue, where they wanted the hospital to be further east. So I suppose that's something that the public were very keen on, and they still talk to us about that, because there was big concern from the professionals within obs and gynae in relation to not having it closer to the east.
Mansell, if I could come in, I think we can't respond immediately about whether we'd still consider, because this whole meeting is about deciding which of the two sites, but the point is heard. And I think it's worth you probably have the statistics, Lee. How many people now travel to our acute sites by public transport? Do you know the percentage?
Well, I wouldn't like to guess at it in public forum, but but we have got that information to hand, and it is in single figure percentages. So it is a very low percentage. That said, we have said from the outset that public transport options are very important to us as part of this. So clearly, bus is likely to be the mainstay of that, but we've talked before about the value of having a train station in close proximity. I think there's a couple of things just to say in response to the question, or that part of the question. Answer was firstly that obviously is a consideration for us, which is why we flagged it as a risk now, because we'd originally were of the understanding that was highly likely, but obviously now that position is changing, but we're still unclear on exactly what will happen. The other thing I would say is that the proximity to the train station is a very important consideration as well. And so all three sites, if the Sinclair's train station was built, would have a train station within a kilometre or so of them. But actually, ideally, you'd want it even closer than that for people to use it. So that we haven't got a perfect solution in any of the sites, but certainly the changing position with Sinclair's is something for us to factor into our decision making in the next part. And I think probably Phil is best to answer or to give a view on the obstetric side.
Thanks. Thanks, Mansell, for the question. I was going to come in, did want to come in generally with a clinical sort of view. I suppose on the specifics of the obstetrics point, we touched on this at our last board when we considered the 5 sites, and we laid out the concerns about sustainability of an obstetric unit in the new hospital being of really significant importance, because if we build a new hospital, we would definitely want obstetrics, pediatrics and neonatal services within that hospital, because services are all networked together, and obstetrics is a really key component of that to enable other services to be there. So it's really important we do have a sustainable obstetric service in our new hospital. When you look at the figures on page 34 of Lee's presentation, whether it's cited actually in Whitland or St Clair's, it will still be quite a small unit, which is why, of course, the clinicians have raised this. I've looked at the latest figures this morning for units across England, and those numbers would put us in the lower 20% of units. And the reason that's important is because trainees need access to the range of cases. So I suppose the point is it's a very relevant point. We believe that the numbers of trainees that we would see in Whitland and St Clair's that we've modelled look to be sustainable in themselves. However, there's no doubt the further east you go, the more sustainable the unit would be. And whilst we haven't seen, as Leah said, any differential for other services, there is bound to be a factor that the further east you go, services will be more sustainable from a clinical angle. I know we're looking at lots of different factors here. So I suppose for that reason, I think clinicians thinking about specialist services would be arguing for the St Clair's site to be part of the consideration. However, of course, we do have to consider access for the population, and part of the reason for the zone was that we wanted services to be close to the coast, those communities within Pembrokeshire that are quite remote. There's another angle that for the Ceredigion population, actually, St Clair's generally is more accessible for clinical patients. So I suppose the other completely different point, if I may, Chair, make just about from a clinical perspective, is that the drivers for change that underpinned the development of this strategy were considered and evolved really carefully through a discovery phase in this strategy, which really started late in 2016 and 2017. And they described a real sustainability challenge for a whole range of clinical services, with concerns about their impact on quality of care for our public. And we are now 8 years on since we started developing those drivers of change. So they looked pretty stark back in 2017. And, you know, a lot of the things that we described there are starting to come to pass in our clinical services, and people are used to that. I know for Mandy and myself, particularly as clinical exec, there's a real worry about that, because I don't think the clinicians involved at that time envisaged that we would only be at this stage in 2023. I know we've had COVID, but really, I think it's a long time to have maintained those services and those risks since that time, and they are only worsening year by year. So, you know, everything that people are saying about the urgency of this, I think, would be echoed by the clinicians.
Yeah, thank you, Phil. That's a really stark reminder. And it fits into, unfortunately, the time it's going to take to get even further down the road, which is really, really worrying. That period of time will be even longer, and the services will be even under more pressure than they are now. So thank you. Any other questions? Mandy?
I wonder if I may just make a comment, and it's less about the land selection, but it does have relevance in the context of new hospital. So if I take us back to the strategy, the new hospital build is one element of the work that we had proposed was essential to meet the needs of our population. So whilst we have the very real dilemma of the land selection, where a new hospital would be built, in the meantime, and I think the point that Phil is alluding to is that the pathways of change that we need to put in place, because hospital care, the bulk of it is actually provided in our communities. So in tandem with all of the work that we're doing, and I suppose I want to give some assurance that whilst we are worried about our aged estate, we are worried about the conditions and the facilities in which care is currently being provided, we are also making steps and strides to actually implement the community element of our strategy. So whilst it is taking, and it is disappointing that we are behind the curve and the timelines that we first set around the new build for the new hospital, we are working hard to make sure that the other elements of that strategy are being progressed. So I just need to remind people of that as well.
Thanks, Mandy. And at the end, when I'm going to sum up, I'll remind us all again. I think it's because today is the single issue of the land for the hospital, but the whole foundation of the strategy is care closer to home and in the community, which, as you say, is progressing and has progressed. Anna.
Thanks, Chair. I think all of us around this table are really clear that West Wales needs a solution that is not straightforward to deliver, but nevertheless we have to persist and do what we can in some very complex circumstances. And I think today we have been very open in describing the dilemmas of our current position alongside the ambition that we have for the future. And we know that it is so much more than the bricks and mortar of building a new hospital. And I do wonder, as a sort of a reflection around our consultation process, that seems to be a case that we are still struggling to make with at least the people who have engaged in the process. I don't know whether that's reflective of the general public. And so I think there's something important about thinking about how do we close that gap without causing undue alarm about the services that are available for people today, for those people who need them today. I wonder if I could sort of bring us back though to the recommendation in front of us around looking at whether we can narrow the shortlist
from 3 to 2. We have a really clear report in Appendix 10, which I think is very helpful in laying out very openly exactly the complexities of the decision that we're faced with. And within that conclusion in Appendix 10, we see that there is, or we're advised that there is a very high risk that the Health Board will lose the opportunity to acquire the sites at Spring Gardens and at St Clair's. I wonder, therefore, to what extent are we really in a position of making a choice versus being presented with a solution? And if we are in the position where we go from 3 to 1 for reasons beyond our control, what does that mean for what then happens? I think there must be members of the public who are wondering that, and it would be helpful to get a sense of what exec colleagues are thinking might be, what might happen in that scenario.
Thanks, Anna.
Do you want me to respond? Yeah, I think it's a really important point, Anna, as we've discussed. So I think the extent to which we've got a choice. So I guess what I would say at this point is that all 3 sites are still in the process. So the landowners have not requested at this point to remove or exclude themselves from the process, and dialogue is ongoing. So we're not at the point where we have definitively got fewer options available to us. What we are facing, though, is a very real risk that, in the main, because of the timeliness of the process, that because of the fact it's now extended, that may lead to that point where landowners do choose to go a different route, essentially. And that is not fully within our control. So I guess what I would say at this moment is that there are 2 factors within the information that I think is important to consider. One is around the extent to which we think we could reach financially acceptable terms with landowners, and then the second is the time frame over which they're willing to hold on, if you like. There is a difference between the sites, as I've mentioned, in regard to the first of those points. The second of those points, both landowners are in that position where our current timeline, is in picking up my response to Judith, means that is where the high risk comes in, because as far as our process is concerned, that we would have to be honest and acknowledge that would lead us in a high risk of losing both sites for that. So I guess what I'm saying is that doesn't mean, therefore, that all is lost in relation to those 2 sites. We could come to a different agreement with either of them, but there are challenges within that. And equally, if we were able to reach a different position with the Welsh Government in relation to how we handle the identification and agreement and subsequent purchase of a site different to what is currently set out in the business case process, then that would satisfy probably at least one of the landowners, but that is obviously uncertain. That's a discussion for us to have. But the indication is that timing is the primary concern there with one of them. So I think we have to assess the information in front of us. We've obviously gone through a process of trying to. It's been an open process in trying to look for sites that are available to us. Even through the consultation that we've had now and the visibility around that, we've not had new sites proposed within the zone beyond the 3 that we've picked up here, and obviously 2 of those are outside the zone. So the alternative options are not immediately obvious, I guess, in relation to that. So the choice that we would face at that point would be whether if we end up in a scenario with just 1 site, whether we proceed with just 1 site, and that would be legitimate from a business case process. We've already confirmed that it's technically viable and meets all the criteria that we've set up to this point. Or the alternative option would be we revisit that whole process, I guess, and look again for further options, but without without us obviously understanding whether they were feasible or not. So that is a situation we don't want to find ourselves in for obvious reason. But it is an inevitable risk associated with the timeline that we're working to. I guess it's just worth making the point on that when we originally submitted the programme business case, the intention would be that the business case process that I described earlier and this land selection process would have aligned. So we could have been in the position today where we were midway through an outline business case process that could have allowed us to make some decisions. Because they're out of sync, we're in this situation. So just really a consequence of that. And we effectively made the decision a year ago to just continue with the process, because otherwise we'd have obviously been putting ourselves back quite a period. So that then carried a risk, which is the risk we're now trying to manage. So I think the key point is as we sit here today, we have 3 sites on the table. None of them have been taken off. There are different risks associated with them, and there are different options, I guess, as we proceed as to how we could deal with that. Not all of that is within the Health Board's gift and subject to that discussion with the Welsh Government. And clearly then if we reach a position where we are just down to 1 site, then we'll have that quite clear choice as to whether we proceed on that basis or whether we look to do something different, whatever that may be, I suppose. Is that okay?
Thanks, Lee. Did you want to come in, Steve?
I think Lee said most of it, but it gave me an opportunity to think about your question, because as always it gets to the heart of the matter. But I guess for me, considerations or making choices about something of this magnitude, whether it's in our public lives or indeed in our private lives when we're making big decisions, you have to do them cognizant of the risks that you have in front of them. But that doesn't invalidate the need to make a choice. I don't think. I think there is a clear need for us to try and continue to move forward with the process, be very explicit about the risks we're managing. Some of those risks may become into issues, but as we sit here today, as Lee said, these are still choices that are within our gift to make. If that changes, I think we then need to consider what next steps will be, and I think there'll be further board discussion around that. But all 3 of these sites, as we've heard at the moment, the reason we've got them is because they all have something to offer that could deliver our strategy. So I don't think we're in a weak position, but we do need to be very cognizant that there are risks in all of this as we make that choice.
Okay. Please, thank you for coming. On the basis of the extensive evidence and the detailed evidence which has been done in accordance with best practice and the discussion that we've had, I'd like to propose that we have a 10-minute adjournment while I summarise for you, for your consideration, the debate and put proposals to you, and we go back to the recommendations and we agree or otherwise the recommendations. Is everybody happy with that? Okay, 10 minutes adjournment. Okay, diolch yn fawr and thank you everybody and welcome back. Today is another important step towards delivering our strategy, which was agreed in 2018 after extensive consultation with the public and with clinicians. As you know, and as we've discussed today, our strategy includes, in fact, it's based upon a series of integrated health and care centres designed with local communities right across Carmarthenshire, Ceredigion and Pembrokeshire, and investment in and repurposing Glangwili and Withybush hospitals. All of this we intend and have been doing to bring care closer to home. But a vital and much needed part of our strategy, now more than ever, as we've discussed, is a new urgent and planned care hospital fit for future generations. Today we've considered all the evidence to inform us and enable us to decide, based on that evidence, where the new hospital should be sited. And we have been asked to consider the reduction of the shortlist from 3 sites to 2 sites. We've considered the consultation final report, independently produced by ORS, which incorporates the views from the public and stakeholders gathered from the 23rd of February 2023 until the 19th of March 2023. We've also considered today the Equality and Health Impact Assessment, which is a live document, the technical appraisal, the town planning consent strategy, the biophilic assessment, and commercial, financial, and clinical and workforce appraisals. A great deal of detailed evidence gathering has been undertaken, all of which is available to members of the public on our website. We are pleased that we've been assured by the Consultation Institute, which has given us a best practice recognition for the land appraisal process and best practice for the public consultation process. In relation to the 3 sites, may I summarise for members and both the evidence and our debate and propose a way forward for your consideration. So briefly, St Clair's. This site has the highest public support, whilst recognising the difference in responses depending on where people lived. It has a high technical risk, which is not insurmountable, we are told. There is a commercial risk, but not as high as Spring Gardens. And it's the most positive site in terms of recruitment and retention of staff and has the less clinical risk. Spring Gardens Whitland, there is a worry from a commercial point of view. It has the highest risk of the 3 sites, and it has neither the public support and has the highest clinical risk. Tynewydd Whitland, it has the lowest commercial risk, the lowest technical risk, the best biophilic opportunity, it's least liked by the public, it's in public ownership, it's the largest site for expansion and the closest to the train station. I propose taking all the evidence, and that's just a very, very brief summary, into account, that we take forward as a board the Tynewydd site in Whitland and the St Clair's site. And I just wondered if members can indicate whether they favour going forward that way, or are there any objections? Okay, thank you. If I can now go to the recommendations. We note the best practice quality assurance certificate achieved from the Consultation Institute. We have considered the key findings from the Land Consultation Closing Report following our period of conscientious consideration. We have decided to reject the 3 alternative site suggestions based on the rationale provided within the report. We note the ongoing development of the Equality Health Impact Assessment. We consider the evidence today which has been presented in relation to the technical and commercial risks. We've considered the impact of the financial report, and we have decided which 2 sites that we will take forward. I'd like to give a huge thanks to the team. Eldeg, thank you for attending today. I know you've been pivotal in this, and Lee and all our partners, and particularly to the members of the public the staff, our partner organisations and the wider community for their active participation in the public consultation process regarding our new hospital site. Their valuable insights and thoughtful feedback have provided a solid foundation for our discussion and our decisions. So diolch yn fawr. As we've heard today, we submitted our plans to the Welsh Government in early 2022. We've also heard that that was on the basis of the discovery phase that Phil outlined, where there was real concern about the fragility of our services at that time, and we find ourselves in the same place and with even more concern. If we are successful in our programme business case, this could result in unprecedented investment in health and social care and the economy of West Wales in the region of £1.3 billion, creating jobs and the health services that we so need. And we heard from you and the sustainable jobs, the real jobs. And what we didn't hear today is the work that we've been doing as a health board with the FE colleges, with the small and medium enterprises to create apprenticeships in our area so that and upskill already the building workforce so that we'll be able to build this hospital ourselves and maintain this hospital ourselves, home knitted by the people of West Wales. And I said, and we have heard, that without this investment and without this new hospital, our services will continue to be spread too thinly and to remain fragile. And our staff and our patients will continue to suffer the consequences. And we will continue to be delivering our services in two hospitals which are no longer fit for purpose. And I'm going to repeat again because I mean this. Never has it been more urgent that we in West Wales have a new hospital fit for purpose and fit for our future generations. So thank you everyone. It's a long process. We wish it to be expedited, particularly in the light of what we're facing with RAC and the other deterioration in our two main hospitals. Thank you for the hard work, and let's keep pushing forward so that we eventually realise the vision which the people of West Wales want. Diolch yn fawr, everybody. And I call the meeting closed. Thank you.